In this 1890 family photograph, everyone focused on her smile, but her fingers reveal a secret. The photograph arrived at the Chicago Historical Medical Archive in February 2024, part of a donation from Northwestern Memorial Hospital's defunct pathology museum. Dr. Michael Torres, a forensic pathologist who specialized in historical trauma analysis, was cataloging medical artifacts when he encountered the image tucked inside a folder labeled Domestic Injury Cases, 1885-1895. The photograph showed a prosperous family posed in an elegant parlor, the setting elaborate with heavy velvet curtains, ornate furniture, and expensive Persian rugs visible in the background. The photographer's embossed mark at the bottom read, Sterling and Associates Fine Photography, Chicago, Illinois, 1890. 4 people were arranged in the traditional Victorian composition. A distinguished man in his mid-40s seated in a carved chair, wearing an expensive suit with gold watch chain visible across his vest. Standing beside him was a woman of perhaps 35, her hand resting on his shoulder, wearing an elaborate silk dress with intricate beading and lace collar. 2 children, a boy of about 10 and a girl of perhaps 7, stood on either side, dressed in their finest clothing. But it was the woman who captured Michael's attention immediately. She was smiling, not the typical Victorian stern expression, but a genuine, broad smile that showed teeth, unusual for the era's portrait conventions. Her face was beautiful, carefully arranged hair framing delicate features, her posture perfect. Everything about her presentation suggested happiness, prosperity, contentment. Yet something felt wrong to Michael's trained eye. He leaned closer, studying her more carefully. The smile seemed too wide, too forced, the kind of expression someone makes when commanded to look happy, rather than actually feeling joy. Her eyes, visible even through the sepia tones, didn't match the smile. They appeared tired, almost resigned. And then Michael noticed her hands. The woman's left hand rested on her husband's shoulder as required by the formal pose, but her right hand hung at her side, partially visible against her dark dress. Michael reached for his magnifying glass and examined the hand more closely. Even in the aged photograph, even through more than a century of fading, he could see abnormalities in her fingers. The joints appeared swollen, the fingers themselves slightly crooked, and there seemed to be discoloration on the knuckles that didn't match the rest of her skin tone. Michael had examined thousands of injury photographs during his career, both modern and historical. He recognized what he was seeing. The telltale signs of repeated trauma, poorly healed fractures, chronic damage that spoke of violence endured over time. This woman's perfect smile hid a terrible secret, and her damaged hands were about to reveal the truth after 134 years of silence. Michael immediately transferred the photograph to his digital imaging laboratory. Using high-resolution scanning technology and forensic analysis software designed for examining historical medical photographs, he created detailed images of the woman's hands that revealed far more than the original photograph showed to the naked eye. The evidence was damning and heartbreaking. Her right hand, the one hanging at her side and partially visible in the portrait, showed multiple abnormalities consistent with repeated traumatic injury. The index and middle fingers were slightly bent at unnatural angles, suggesting old fractures that had healed improperly without medical setting. The knuckles appeared enlarged and irregular, characteristic of repeated impact injuries. Most telling were the subtle shadows and discolorations Michael could enhance digitally. Dark patches on the backs of her fingers and across her knuckles indicated old bruising, and the way her hand hung suggested limited range of motion, possibly from permanent damage to tendons or ligaments. Michael pulled up reference materials from Victorian medical journals documenting common injuries. What he was seeing in this woman's hand matched perfectly with what 19th century physicians called defensive injuries, damage sustained when victims raised their hands to protect themselves from blows. The pattern was unmistakable. She had raised her hands to shield her face or body from strikes, and her fingers had been broken, bruised, and damaged repeatedly over what must have been months or years of abuse. Michael examined her left hand, the one resting on her husband's shoulder in the photograph. The positioning was more formal and controlled, but even there he could see subtle abnormalities. The ring finger appeared slightly swollen at the middle joint, and the hand's overall posture seemed stiff, as though maintaining the pose caused discomfort. He enhanced the image further, studying her wrists where they emerged from the elaborate lace cuffs of her dress. Faint shadows suggested old bruising there too, marks consistent with being grabbed forcefully, restrained, or pushed. Michael sat back from his computer screen, feeling the familiar anger that came with recognizing signs of violence, whether in modern emergency room photographs or century-old portraits. This woman had been hurt badly and repeatedly, and someone had photographed her smiling as though everything was perfect. He needed to identify this family and find out what had happened to her. The photograph had been filed with domestic injury cases, suggesting that someone in 1890s Chicago had recognized what Michael was seeing now. Perhaps there were medical records, hospital admissions, or legal documents that would tell the full story. Michael began searching through the archives index, looking for any documentation that might be connected to this photograph. What he found made his blood run cold. The folder containing the photograph also held a thin sheaf of papers, yellowed and fragile, that Michael carefully removed and examined. They were medical records from Chicago's Cook County Hospital, dated between 1888 and 1891, documenting multiple visits by a patient identified only as Mrs. C.W., female, age 32-35, residence Prairie Avenue. Prairie Avenue had been Chicago's most exclusive street in the 1890s, home to the city's wealthiest families, industrialists, railroad magnates, merchant princes. Mrs. C.W. had been a woman of significant social standing. The medical notes, written in the precise handwriting of Victorian physicians, chronicled a devastating pattern. October 1888, patient presented with fracture of right index finger, claims injury from closing door on hand, finger set and splinted. Patient appeared anxious and reluctant to provide details. March 1889, patient returned with severe bruising to right hand and wrist, fracture of middle finger suspected. Patient states she fell on stairs. Bruising pattern inconsistent with fall injury. Patient became distressed when questioned and departed before treatment completed. July 1889. Patient admitted with multiple rib fractures, extensive bruising to torso and arms. Husband accompanied patient and explained she had fallen from horse. Patient remained silent during examination. Injuries inconsistent with riding accident. Recommended extended observation, but patient's husband insisted on immediate discharge. December 1889. Patient presented with suspected fracture of right wrist, severe bruising to face, partially concealed with powder, split lip. Husband not present. Patient very distressed, weeping throughout examination. When asked directly about injuries, patient became silent and refused further treatment. Left hospital against medical advice. Michael read through 6 such entries, each documenting injuries that the attending physicians clearly suspected were inflicted rather than accidental. The final entry, from February 1891, was the most disturbing. Patient brought to hospital unconscious, severe head trauma, multiple fractures to hands, defensive injuries, extensive bruising. Husband claims patient fell down full flight of stairs. Injuries absolutely inconsistent with fall. Patient regained consciousness briefly, appeared terrified of husband's presence. Attempted to speak privately with patient, but husband refused to leave room. Patient's prognosis grave. Recommended police notification, but hospital administrator declined, citing patient's family social standing and lack of definitive proof. There were no further entries after February 1891. Michael searched the remaining documents in the folder and found a newspaper clipping from the Chicago Tribune, March 1891, brief and matter-of-fact. Mrs. Catherine Whitmore, wife of prominent industrialist Charles Whitmore, died March 3rd at age 34 from injuries sustained in accidental fall. Services private. In lieu of flowers, donations may be made to the Chicago Women's Relief Society. Catherine Whitmore. The woman in the photograph finally had a name. Michael spent the next week researching the Whitmore family, uncovering a story of wealth, social prominence, and carefully concealed violence. Charles Whitmore had been one of Chicago's industrial titans, owner of Whitmore Steel Manufacturing, a company that supplied metal for railroads and construction across the Midwest. The 1890 census listed Charles Whitmore, age 45, manufacturer, residing at 1847 Prairie Avenue with his wife Catherine, age 33, and their 2 children, Charles Jr., age 11, and Margaret, age 8. The household also included 3 servants, a cook, a housemaid, and a nanny. City directories and social registers documented the Whitmores' prominence in Chicago society. Charles served on the boards of several banks and was a major donor to the Art Institute of Chicago. Catherine was listed as a member of the Chicago Woman's Club and various charitable organizations, though Michael noticed her attendance at public events became increasingly sparse after 1888. Michael found dozens of mentions of the Whitmore family in Chicago newspapers from the 1880s and early 1890s. Society column reports of dinner parties they hosted, charity events Catherine attended, business achievements Charles celebrated. On the surface, they appeared to be the perfect wealthy family, but Michael also found something else in the Chicago Tribune archives, a series of small notices that painted a different picture. In September 1887, a brief item mentioned that Mrs. Charles Whitmore had been indisposed and unable to attend the annual Palmer House Charity Gala, sending her regrets. In January 1888, another notice explained that Mrs. Whitmore continues her convalescence from a recent riding accident and remains at home. In April 1889, the Society column noted that Mrs. Whitmore had unfortunately suffered another household mishap and will be recovering for several weeks. The pattern was clear to Michael. Each of these indispositions, accidents, and mishaps likely corresponded with episodes of violence severe enough that Catherine couldn't appear in public with visible injuries. The Whitmores' social circle had politely looked the other way, accepting whatever explanations were offered rather than acknowledging the obvious truth. Michael found Catherine's obituary from March 1891, longer and more detailed than the brief death notice he had seen earlier. It described her as beloved wife and devoted mother, who had been active in charitable works, and was mourned by all who knew her gentle nature and generous spirit. Reading between the Victorian euphemisms, Michael understood what gentle nature really meant. Catherine had been quiet, submissive, non-confrontational, exactly what a violently abusive husband would demand. The obituary made no mention of the circumstances of her death beyond calling it a tragic accident. Michael wanted to know who had documented Catherine's injuries so carefully in those hospital records and why the photograph had been preserved in a medical archive. He found the answer in the signature at the bottom of each medical note. Dr. James Sullivan, attending physician. Dr. James Sullivan had been a prominent Chicago physician specializing in trauma surgery at Cook County Hospital. Michael found an obituary for him from 1923, describing a long career treating victims of industrial accidents, fires, and other emergencies. But there was one detail that caught Michael's attention. In his later years, Sullivan had become an outspoken advocate for legal protections for victims of domestic violence. Michael searched through the Northwestern Medical School archives, where Sullivan had taught after retiring from hospital practice, and found something extraordinary. Sullivan's personal journals, donated to the medical school after his death, containing entries about cases that had troubled him throughout his career. The entry from March 1891 was devastating. Mrs. Catherine Whitmore died today from injuries I knew were inflicted by her husband. I had treated her 4 times previously for accidents that were obviously beatings. Each time I documented my suspicions, and each time the hospital administration refused to involve police because Mr. Whitmore is wealthy and influential. When she arrived unconscious last month with injuries that could only have resulted from a severe beating, I begged the hospital director to notify authorities. He refused, citing lack of definitive proof and concern about false accusations against a respected citizen. Mrs. Whitmore died without ever being able to tell the truth about what her husband did to her. I failed her. The hospital failed her. The law failed her. I have kept the photograph taken at her husband's insistence in 1890, showing her smiling as though happy, while her hands reveal the truth about her suffering. Perhaps someday this evidence will matter. Perhaps someday someone will care enough to see what I saw and take action when it might actually save a woman's life. Michael felt tears sting his eyes. Dr. Sullivan had recognized Catherine's suffering, had tried to help her, and had preserved evidence of the abuse precisely because he knew no one would hold Charles Whitmore accountable in 1891. The photograph had been kept as testimony, as proof of what had been done to Catherine Whitmore while Chicago's elite society had looked away. But there was more in Sullivan's journal. Entries documenting other cases of wealthy women whose injuries were dismissed as accidents, whose pleas for help were ignored because their husbands were too important to accuse. Michael realized that Catherine's story wasn't unique. She was one of countless Victorian women trapped in violent marriages, with no legal recourse, no social support, and no way to escape. Michael wanted to understand what had happened to Catherine's children after her death. Charles Jr. would have been 11 in 1891, Margaret only 8, old enough to remember their mother, old enough possibly to have witnessed the violence that killed her. He found Charles Whitmore Jr. in later census records. By 1900, at age 20, he was listed living with his father on Prairie Avenue and working in the family steel business. By 1910, he had married and established his own household. And by 1920, he was running Whitmore Steel Manufacturing himself, his father Charles having died in 1918. But Michael found something unexpected in the Chicago Tribune archives from 1932. A lengthy letter to the editor written by Charles Whitmore Jr., now in his 50s, supporting proposed legislation to strengthen legal protections for victims of domestic violence. The letter was remarkable for its candor. As a child, I witnessed my father's violence toward my mother. I was too young and powerless to stop him, and the adults around us, neighbors, family, friends, even physicians, chose not to intervene because my father was wealthy and influential. My mother died from injuries my father inflicted, though it was called an accident to preserve our family's reputation. I have carried the guilt of my silence for 40 years. If legal protections had existed in 1891 that allowed my mother to seek help without requiring her to prove abuse in court, or that allowed physicians to report suspected violence without fear of lawsuits, she might have lived. I support this legislation in her memory and for all the women still suffering in silence as she did. The letter had been published and generated significant response, both supportive and critical. Some readers praised Charles Jr. His honesty. Others condemned him for speaking ill of the dead and airing family matters publicly. Michael found similar advocacy work connected to Margaret Whitmore, Catherine's daughter. After marrying in 1905, Margaret had become involved with the Chicago Women's Club and the Illinois Women's Suffrage Association. In 1920, shortly after women gained the right to vote, she had testified before the Illinois state legislature in support of a bill that would make domestic violence a criminal offense rather than a private family matter. Her testimony, preserved in legislative records, was equally powerful. My mother was beaten to death by my father when I was 8 years old. Everyone knew, but no one helped her, because helping would have meant accusing a respectable man. The law must change to protect women like my mother. Both of Catherine's children had spent their adult lives trying to create the legal protections that might have saved their mother. They had broken the silence that Victorian society had demanded, and they had used their privilege and social standing to advocate for women who lacked both. Michael felt profound respect for Charles Jr. and Margaret, who had transformed their childhood trauma into activism despite the social costs. Michael's discovery of Catherine Whitmore's story led him to investigate whether there were other similar cases documented in Chicago's medical archives. What he found was devastating in its scope. Between 1885 and 1900, Cook County Hospital records documented over 300 cases of suspicious injuries in married women from wealthy families, cases where attending physicians had noted that injuries appeared inflicted rather than accidental, but had taken no further action due to patients' social standing. Dr. Sullivan's journals referenced dozens of these cases, including notes about other physicians who had also documented their suspicions, but been overruled by hospital administrators concerned about lawsuits and maintaining relationships with wealthy donors. Michael found a particularly damning document, Minutes from an 1889 Cook County Hospital Board meeting where Dr. Sullivan had proposed a formal policy requiring physicians to report suspected domestic violence cases to police. The proposal had been rejected, with board members arguing it would damage the hospital's reputation with respectable families and open the institution to legal liability for false accusations. The medical establishment had knowingly sacrificed women's safety to protect wealthy men's reputations. Michael also discovered that Catherine's case had been worse than others in one specific way. Charles Whitmore had insisted on the 1890 family photograph being taken and widely distributed to Chicago society, using it as proof that his family was happy and his wife's accidents were genuinely accidental. The photograph with Catherine's forced smile had been sent to newspapers, social organizations, and business associates, a propaganda tool to counter any rumors about violence in the Whitmore household. Dr. Sullivan had kept a copy of that photograph specifically because he recognized it as evidence of coercion. A truly happy woman wouldn't need to smile so desperately while her damaged hands told the truth her mouth couldn't speak. Michael found other photographs in the medical archive, other women smiling for formal portraits while their bodies showed signs of abuse. In some, the evidence was subtle, a stiff posture suggesting pain, carefully positioned clothing hiding bruises, hands positioned to conceal injuries. In others, like Catherine's, the damage was visible to anyone who looked carefully enough. These photographs had been preserved by physicians who recognized what they were seeing, but lacked the legal or social power to intervene. They were testimonies to failure, to silence, to women who had died, while institutions that should have protected them chose not to act. Michael decided Catherine Whitmore's story needed to be told publicly, not just as historical curiosity, but as a reminder of how society's complicity enabled violence against women. Michael wrote a comprehensive research paper documenting Catherine Whitmore's case. The photographic evidence of her injuries, the hospital records showing repeated abuse, Dr. Sullivan's journal entries, and the testimonies of her children decades later. He submitted it to the American Journal of Forensic Medicine and History, and it was accepted for publication in June 2024. But Michael wanted to reach beyond academic audiences. He contacted the Chicago Tribune, which ran a feature article about Catherine under the headline, "The Smile That Hid the Truth: How a 134-year-old photograph reveals domestic violence in Gilded Age Chicago." The article included the 1890 Whitmore family photograph with enhanced images showing Catherine's damaged hands, explained the forensic evidence Michael had identified, and told Catherine's full story with sensitivity and historical context. It discussed how Victorian society's refusal to intervene in wealthy families' private matters had enabled abusers, how women had no legal recourse or protection, and how institutions like hospitals had prioritized reputation over victims' safety. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Michael received hundreds of emails from readers, from domestic violence advocates recognizing the parallels between Catherine's story and modern victims' experiences, from historians studying gender and violence in the Victorian era, and from descendants of other Chicago families who shared similar stories about ancestors whose accidental deaths had hidden darker truths. But the most significant contact came from a woman named Elizabeth Morrison, a social worker and domestic violence counselor from Evanston, Illinois. "I'm Charles Whitmore Jr.'s great-granddaughter," she wrote. "My family has known about Catherine's story for generations. My grandfather told us about witnessing his grandmother's murder when he was a child and how it motivated his father's later advocacy work. But we never knew there was photographic evidence of the abuse, or that Dr. Sullivan had documented it so carefully. I work with domestic violence victims every day, and Catherine's story is still relevant. Women are still trapped, still told their abusers are good men who made mistakes, still blamed for not leaving situations they have no safe way to escape. I want to use Catherine's story to educate people about how little has changed in some ways." Michael met with Elizabeth and her family, sharing all his research. Elizabeth's grandmother was Margaret Whitmore's daughter, making her Catherine's great-great-granddaughter. The family had preserved letters, photographs, and documents related to Catherine and the advocacy work her children had done. Together, they decided to create a public exhibit about Catherine's story and its broader historical context. The exhibit opened at the Chicago History Museum in September 2024, titled "Behind the Smile: Domestic Violence and Silence in Gilded Age Chicago." The centerpiece was the 1890 Whitmore family photograph, displayed prominently with enhanced forensic images showing Catherine's injured hands and detailed medical explanation of what the damage indicated. But the exhibit went far beyond Catherine's individual story. Michael and Elizabeth had worked with museum curators to create a comprehensive narrative about domestic violence in late 19th century Chicago. The legal structures that prevented women from escaping abusive marriages, the social pressures that enforced silence, and the institutions that prioritized wealthy men's reputations over women's lives. The exhibit included Catherine's hospital records, Dr. Sullivan's journal entries, the testimonies of Charles Jr. and Margaret from the 1920s and 1930s, and information about how domestic violence laws had evolved from the Victorian era to modern times. It also featured stories of other Chicago women who had died from domestic violence between 1880 and 1920, their cases documented in medical and legal records but never publicly acknowledged. Most powerfully, the exhibit connected Catherine's historical story to contemporary domestic violence, showing statistics about modern victims, explaining why leaving abusive relationships is often dangerous and complicated, and providing resources for people experiencing violence. On opening day, over 800 people attended. Elizabeth Morrison spoke about her great-great-grandmother and the family legacy of advocacy. Catherine died because society chose not to help her. Her children spent their lives trying to change that society. My grandfather continued their work. And I continue it today as a domestic violence counselor. Catherine's suffering wasn't meaningless. It motivated generations of change. But we still have so much work to do. Michael spoke about the forensic evidence and how photographs could preserve truths that society tried to hide. When I first saw Catherine's smile in that photograph, I almost missed what her hands were telling me. But once I looked closely, I couldn't unsee it. That's what I hope this exhibit does. Makes people look closely at what we still try not to see about violence against women. A domestic violence survivor spoke about seeing Catherine's photograph and recognizing her own experience. People always ask why victims don't just leave, why we smile and pretend everything's fine. Looking at Catherine's forced smile while her broken fingers tell the real story, that's exactly what it feels like. You perform happiness while your body carries the truth. The exhibit remained open for a year and was visited by over 50,000 people, including school groups, social work students, law enforcement training programs, and domestic violence advocacy organizations from across the country. One evening near the end of the exhibit's run, Michael stood alone in the gallery, looking at the photograph of Catherine Whitmore. Her forced smile, her damaged hands, her children standing beside her unaware that their mother would be dead within months. It was almost unbearable to contemplate. But beside the original 1890 photograph, the museum had installed another image, a portrait of Catherine from earlier in her marriage, dated 1882, before the documented abuse had begun. In this earlier photograph, Catherine's smile was genuine, her eyes bright, her hands unmarred and relaxed. She had been 25 years old, recently married, probably still hopeful about her future. The contrast between the two photographs was devastating, showing what violence had stolen from her over 8 years. Elizabeth Morrison joined Michael in front of the photographs. "I wish I could have known her," she said quietly. "My great-grandmother Margaret talked about her mother sometimes, said Catherine loved music, that she played piano beautifully, that she was kind to everyone, especially to people who worked in their household. She was a whole person with interests and talents and dreams, not just a victim." "That's important to remember," Michael agreed. The abuse was done to her, but it wasn't who she was. They stood in silence for a moment, then Elizabeth continued. "The exhibit has had an impact beyond what we expected. 3 women contacted me through the museum saying that seeing Catherine's story helped them recognize their own situations and seek help. They're alive now because Catherine's story was finally told. That matters." Michael nodded. Dr. Sullivan kept this photograph hoping it would matter someday. It took 134 years, but he was right. The exhibit had indeed made a difference. It had been featured in national news coverage about domestic violence and historical advocacy. Several universities had requested permission to use the materials in teaching about gender history, medical ethics, and social work. And most importantly, it had helped people really see, what society still tries to ignore about violence against women. On the exhibit's final day, the museum held a closing ceremony. Catherine's descendants attended, along with domestic violence advocates, historians, medical professionals, and survivors. They stood together before the photograph of Catherine Whitmore, her forced smile and her damaged hands visible for everyone to see. Catherine couldn't speak her truth while she was alive, Elizabeth said in her closing remarks. Victorian society demanded her silence, and when she died, the silence continued. But her body told the truth anyway. Her hands preserved the evidence in that photograph, waiting for someone who would finally look closely enough to see it. Now, 134 years later, everyone can see. Catherine's voice has finally been heard. Michael watched as visitors filed past the photograph one last time, many stopping to read Catherine's story, some wiping away tears, others taking photographs to share. He thought about all the women whose stories were still hidden in old photographs, in medical records, in family secrets kept for generations. There are more stories like Catherine's waiting to be uncovered, he said to Elizabeth. More photographs where the truth is visible if you know what to look for. Then we keep looking, Elizabeth replied firmly. We keep telling their stories. We keep making sure they're not forgotten. And in the quiet of the closing gallery, standing before the photograph that had preserved Catherine Whitmore's silent testimony for more than a century, Michael felt that somehow, across the vast distance of 134 years, Catherine would have been grateful that her suffering had finally been acknowledged, her truth finally spoken, and her memory honored not just as a victim, but as a woman who had deserved so much better than what her life and her society had given her. The photograph remained in the museum's permanent collection, continuing to teach new generations about violence, silence, and the importance of looking closely at what people try to hide, ensuring that Catherine Whitmore's forced smile and her damaged hands would never stop telling the truth she couldn't speak in life.